Good morning and welcome to what I'm fairly sure is chapter 6 of these classes on writing the history of the First World War. And I have now finished looking at sources, and I went into had a couple of parentheses about writing the history of popular song, and I'm going to move on to something quite different. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and present rather a large number of history books about the First World War, and say a little bit about their approaches. As you can imagine, I'm not expecting you to read them all. Indeed, I have not read them all. And perhaps you remember that in total there are around 60,000 books written about the First World War. So even the world expert, which is not me, has not read all of them by a long chalk, as we say in English. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my inspiration, if you like, from the book by Antoine Prost and Winter, who wrote a book called, which was published in French under the title Penser la Grande Guerre, and in English under the title, I think it was The Great War in History. And what they try to do is they try to categorize the historical work which has been done on the First World War. And they divide the historical work into three big fields, and they point out that each field becomes dominant at a particular moment in the 20th century. So this does not mean, of course, that the previous fields disappear. So each new field comes along and might become dominant, in particular in university work. And I think I mentioned to you that universities are essential for historians because it's extremely difficult to make a living by writing history books unless you're also employed to teach history in universities. Yes, I just lost my thread there. Yes, so three fields of historical approach, each one becoming dominant one after the other, but the first and the second absolutely not disappearing simply because the third one appears, and each one developing and changing in its own way. And what are these three fields? Well, first of all, the accent is on military and diplomatic history. Some decades later, social history, and finally, cultural history. And I will be looking at these different things. So let's have a look at the first field then: military and diplomatic history. Very nice. Now, so the first field is military and diplomatic history, and this begins to be written immediately the First World War is over. Sometimes it is sponsored by governments, and this historiography, an enormous number of books, aims to explain and quite often justify the diplomatic decisions and the strategic decisions of governments and of generals. This period is also characterized by the publication of memoirs of leading politicians or generals such as Lloyd George and Douglas Haig, memoirs which often turn out to look rather like self-justification, which is a perfectly honorable occupation. Now, this is a very interesting thing about this particular period is that the experience of the ordinary soldier is not considered at this time by historians to be part of history. And they don't write about it. And this is even the case when the historian in question has been involved himself in the First World War. And we have the example of Mr. Renouvin, who wrote this very respected work, La crise européenne et la Première Guerre mondiale. Interestingly enough, he was in the war and he was seriously wounded, and not once in his book does he say anything about his own experience in the war, because at this time the ordinary soldier, that's not history. History is the big decisions. It's the history of the strategy and of the politics of the Great War. And the attitude that they have at this time is that the soldier is in the battle and cannot understand it, and it's only by standing on the hills above the battle that you can understand who's going to win and what and why and so on. So this is one of the works of the period of military and diplomatic history, which I will be looking, and I'll be looking at many more. But first of all, let's have a look at the definition in the dictionary. Always useful. The definition in the dictionary of military history. Here we have then the Oxford Dictionary to come up. The study of the role that armed forces played in past events. So I don't think it's difficult to define. It's quite easy to see what is military history and what isn't military history, although as we shall see, it will actually change in a number of ways. Very slowly, the experience of the ordinary soldier, which was not considered respectable by the historian, not worthy of interest by the historian, became more important to people in general. And perhaps this is a slow rise of the democratic spirit. Remember that everybody voting, everybody voting at elections, is a new idea. 1918, all men get the vote and women over 30. A quarter of men were not allowed to vote before 1918 in Britain. And so I think it's important to remember that when sections of the population are not allowed to vote, it's not just that they're not allowed to put this cross on a piece of paper every 5 years. It's actually that the official opinion of society is that they have nothing in their heads and nothing to contribute, and naturally should not be involved in decisions. So democracy in elections is a new idea, and the democratic spirit, where we at least pretend that everybody's opinion and everybody's attitudes has value, is only very slowly generalizing within society, extremely slowly, I should say. Now, the experience of the ordinary soldier might be respected in poetry. And the war poems of Siegfried Sassoon, for example, were popular already very early on, first published in 1919, but still popular today. Here is a very recent 2011 edition of them. So if poetry might consider that the personal experience of the soldier is valuable, nevertheless historians were not so interested in it. Here is another couple of examples of war poems by Wilfred Owen. I mentioned to you that these were among the most popular poems. In fact, for many people, half of the poems they know might be from the First World War. And there you see the Penguin Book of First World War Poetry, which is a bestseller. Now, even today, military history remains a very important component of historiography. So it begins immediately after the war, in particular with these "My Country Was Right and I Will Show You Why" books, often based on official government archives. So they have the authority to say, I know what happened in detail. I know how the decisions were taken in detail. Now, as I say, that military history continues right up to today, and many thousands of books, but military history has changed. And I just have here a few examples of how later military history has approached. For example, some military historians will attack the question of the Great War, the First World War, in parts of the world which have been little written about, or relatively little written about. So, for example, here you have The Untold Tragedy of the Great War in Africa, published a few years ago. Very interesting front page here, a very classic front page, The Untold Tragedy. Now, if you want to sell a history book, it's best to say Untold somewhere on the cover, the unknown history, that that it's a new revelation. Of course, inside it isn't always. So here is one way that later military history could do something a little different. It could present the Great War in parts of the world which had not been mentioned, and indeed. At the beginning of the First World War, there was fighting in Africa, in particular in an attempt to take over Germany's colonies, because Germany had a few colonies in Africa, and a very large number of people were killed in Africa during these battles, but we don't think about them perhaps as much as we should. Another example here, very clearly, military history book produced by the Imperial War Museum, which I shall say more about later. Interesting museum, the Imperial War Museum, even though its name, the Imperial War Museum, it really does sound like you only want to go there if you're an imperialist and you think that, you know, the British Army is wonderful. And in fact, not at all. In fact, the Imperial War Museum has a very critical view of war. And indeed, I remember a few years ago, they had a special exhibition on the history of pacifism in Britain. So they could be quite radical. So they, you know, the history of military operations in Egypt and Palestine. Otherwise, later military historians might concentrate on some particular aspect. So they might concentrate, for example, on a particular weapon. In this case, the U-boats, so the submarine, which the Germans seem to be quite more advanced, quite a lot more advanced than the opposition in that case. So military historian might choose to concentrate on a particular weapon. Here you go, tanks, for example. Tanks are invented in 1916 and have an important role in the First World War, because at the beginning of the First World War, and the reason for the trenches, the reason for the immobility, the reason that nothing happened for very long periods of time, is because at the time the best defensive weapon available was the machine gun. And the best attacking weapon available was the soldier who walked forward. And so you can see the problem here. It's almost, I mean, a caricature, but it's almost the case that if you advance, you lose. A few attempts will be made to break this deadlock. Firstly, gas, which is used first by the Germans and then by the British, and secondly, tanks. And obviously the tank, if it works, because many of the first tanks broke down very quickly, but if the tank works, obviously it can advance against the machine gun, and therefore is from a military point of view, a success. There's a last example, quite a recent one here, then the Indian Empire at War. Actually, I'm not quite sure if it is recent or a recent reprint of an older book, the Indian Empire at War, From Jihad to Victory, the untold story. I told you it's always the untold story of the Indian Army and the First World War. And there you have a colourful picture on the front page. Now, later military history also has a tremendous difference with the first days of the military history in the 20s, and that is that we find more and more, and particularly today, a sharp interest in the experience of ordinary soldiers. Now, this is no doubt the advance of the democratic spirit, the slow weakening of traditional elitism. I remember how strong the elitism was. I mentioned to you that if you went to a private school in Britain in 1914, you were automatically made an officer without any exam or anything like that. It was just the idea that these people are naturally born to rule. These people are naturally born to lead. So a very rigid view. We think we have elitism today, and we do, but even much more solid and unmoving. So the second reason, perhaps, for the renewed interest, or for the new interest in the experience of ordinary soldiers, is the post-war boom in the 50s and 60s, a massive increase in the number of universities, the number of history departments, and indeed a massive increase in the number of historians. The actual number of historians today is far, far more than 100 years ago. And some of these historians, quite a number of these historians, come from relatively ordinary families. They're not all produced by the elite, and so this is no doubt something which encouraged interest for ordinary soldiers. And indeed today, this is the type of First World War history which sells the most books. The experience of the ordinary soldiers in the trenches. That's what you need if you want to sell books. And I have a series of examples here. This is what I call military history from below. So we stay with military questions or military places, the trenches, the training camps, the occasionally some other aspects which I'll come to in a moment. But we're interested in how ordinary people felt. And this can lead to even bestsellers like this one. This is more than 700 pages long. Tommy, the British Soldier on the Western Front, 1914 to 1918, by Richard Holmes, one of the best-selling, as it says on the cover, military historians. And this is absolutely fascinating because it does go into detail. At the same time as you do get a sort of patriotic atmosphere, you get the feeling that he is delighted that the British won and that this was important to him. Nevertheless, all aspects of military life are covered. For example, I remember there's a few pages here in what do gay couples do in the army. And whereas, of course, this is not a question which traditional histories would have showed. Another one then, the experiences of an infantryman in France. It's just taking the experience of one infantryman. Unknown soldiers, the missing of the First World War. So this is an attempt to look at those who were missing, because of course many people died, but their bodies were often never found. And finally, this one, trench warfare. Now, in these stories about soldiers' lives, we can find very original books like this one, Trench Warfare. And this is an excellent example of how a historian can make progress by finding a new question. You might think it's difficult to find a new question about the First World War, but you'd be surprised. And Tony Ashworth, this is a book I think it's in the 1970s, I think. This is entitled Trench Warfare 1914 to 18, the live and let live system, le système du vivre et laisser vivre. And the new question that Tony Ashworth put forward was, what happened in the trenches when there was not a battle? There have been endless history books about what happened in the battles, but what happened when there was not a battle? Because indeed, the typical experience of the soldier was 2 or 3 weeks horrible fighting, and then many months with nothing happening. So what happened if you were on the quiet parts? Well, you had certainly a whole series of interests to follow. Let's imagine that your priority is to remain alive, and for many soldiers, the priority of remaining alive went above the priority of making sure that Britain won the war. But one of the things you should do if you're in is make sure that your company is following orders, but is not excellent. You must not help your company to be excellent, because the excellent companies or detachments are sent to the most dangerous places in the war. They get the excellent ones. And so if you wanted to remain alive, the best thing to do is to be a bit below average. Now, it's dangerous to refuse to fight. That's something completely different, of course. That's very dangerous to refuse to fight, but enthusiasm is not necessary. And indeed, this is what Tony Ashworth uncovered when he looked at what happened in the trenches when there was not a battle on. He discovered the live and let live system, which is basically, if the Germans don't kill any of us, we won't kill any of them. And there's a whole series of rituals about this. Some of them are very simple, like no bumming at breakfast. So everybody can have a breakfast. Everybody likes to have a breakfast. But there was also cooperation between soldiers and enemy soldiers. Now, there are famous examples of this, like the Christmas truce, but these are extreme examples, very everyday examples. If you could get communication over to the other side, say, you bomb on the left in the mornings, or we'll bomb on the right in the afternoons. So on each side, you're showing your hierarchy, you're showing your higher officers, oh, well, we're doing the bombing. Look, here's how many bombs we sent. But in reality, nobody's getting killed because the information has been passed around. And the military leaders understood this little by little, and as the war went on, they trusted less and less the local low-level officers who were often close to their men, and they imposed more and more central decisions. So, for example, nighttime patrols, one of the most effective ways of attacking in trench warfare is in small groups at night. And indeed, the classic way of attacking that we know about, sending everybody over the top in a big wave, is militarily not very good. But the thing about that is you can just order people. You don't. The officers did not need to trust their men if everybody's supposed to leave at the same time. Whereas the most effective military tactics, like the nighttime attacks, depend on having a lot of individual and small group initiative. In any case, a couple of examples. As the war went on, the higher up officers began to insist, this is how many patrols we want attacking every night. And they realized that, well, if you're a small group of soldiers with a low-level officer who's close to you, you go out in a group of 8. So, you know, shall we go right over to the German trenches and attack, or should we just sit here for 2 hours and then go home and say we've tried to attack? Lots of temptations to stay alive by not really fighting. And so the higher officers at one point insisted that every patrol had to bring back a little bit of German barbed wire from the other side. And I'm sure that this sometimes worked, but it was also sometimes the case that the company would steal a large amount of German barbed wire, and then every day they would go out, have a little rest, and cut a little bit off the roll that they kept, so they could come back every day and say, here's the bit of German barbed wire to prove that we've been out attacking, whereas in fact they were not. This is the live and let live system, how not to fight despite the fact that you're in the middle of a war. A lot of the what's the word? A lot of the books about the experience of ordinary soldiers are the memoirs, and here you have one: Mud, Blood, and Bullets, or as they say in the south of England, Mud, Blood, and Bullets. No, bullets. That's bullets. I can't pronounce it in Southern English. You'll have to do it. The memoirs of a machine gunner on the Western fronts. Fascinating memoir. The machine gunner actually at this point tended to be specialized and would move from place to place with his machine gun. So he would turn up somewhere, and somewhere where they'd identified a weakness on the other side, and use his machine gun. And this gentleman was not always very popular, because he would turn up in a part of the front where it had been fairly quiet. They say, oh, I'm going to set up my machine gun. And he found that sometimes it was very unpopular, because he was going to shoot as many people as he could and then leave with his machine gun, and the people in the trench were going to have to suffer the revenge of the people opposite. The other thing you can see here is a rather interesting marketing ploy, in that you can see there are little holes in the cover, and marketing is an important part of historical presentation too, as we shall see. This is the diary of a Great War soldier and artist. So it includes many of the drawings that the soldier did while he was in the trenches, or and so on. Incidentally, just to clarify about the trenches, you don't spend all your time in the trenches. You spend 2 or 3 weeks in the trenches, 2 or 3 weeks rest, 2 or 3 weeks doing support roles. All the food has to be brought, all the ammunition has to be brought, wood to build the trenches and so on, all has to be brought. So there's a huge amount of logistical work behind. So being in the trenches is around 1/3 of your time, and the rest of the time you have a little bit more chance of playing football, massively popular on the Western Front, playing football and so on. So this interesting way. Now, obviously, something new about it, the Diary of a Great War Soldier and Artist. This is likely to perhaps attract a few readers who were not just interested in just another soldier story. Another diary of the Great War. I'm not quite sure what the specificity of this person is. It appears to be an American. Is that the Dixie Division? Yes, the 31st Dixie Division. So someone from the south of the United States. Yeah, so another aspect of military history from below is the publication of diaries, and this one is particularly good. This is the Great War Diaries of Chaplain Kenneth Best. The British Army employed chaplains, that is, that they employed priests, mostly Anglicans, but also a bunch of Catholics and some Jewish rabbis, in order to provide the religious needs of the soldiers, even on the front line. So an interesting idea. This was, as I understand it, it was not quite the same situation in France. Of course, you already had this separation of the state from the church, and indeed in France, if you were a priest, you were conscripted like everybody else and given a gun like everybody else. Whereas in Britain, and particularly in Ireland, but also in Britain, priests were given a special job of being chaplain, and they were not supposed to be involved in the fighting and so on. Tremendously interesting. That I have more to say about religion in the First World War, how religion influenced the First World War, and how the First World War influenced religion in some ways that you might not think likely. Here I have a little quotation from one of the diaries, just to perhaps underline that they could be pretty gory. Just outside the wood, we came to a well-constructed trench. In it, there's a British soldier to every yard, killed on the parapet in trying to hop off. 20 yards in front, a row of dead British soldiers in perfect line as if on parade. Non-commissioned officers in position, and a half dozen paces ahead, their platoon officer, a rusty revolver in one outstretched hand, his whistle still clasped in the other, mowed down by machine guns. We see two men, a Fritz and a Tommy, dead within a yard of each other. The Fritz has a British bayonet through his throat, while the Tommy lies doubled over a Fritz bayonet whose point protrudes from his back. Yeah, so they can be rather vicious. One of the interesting things about diaries, which I may come back to later, is that there are large numbers of stories about what it was like to see your friends killed, and what it was like to be injured, and what it was like to be scared, and so on and so forth. And very few pages consecrated to what it was like to kill soldiers on the other side. Now, this is a war. Somebody must have been killing, and they can't just have been all dying. And so this does reveal one of the weaknesses of diaries and oral history, and in general, direct witnessing of history, that for very understandable reasons, some things are put forward and other things are put into the background because, they might feel to be less honorable, for example. Now, within the military history from below, which has been going on for a long time, there's very much been a tendency to concentrate not just generally history from below, like Tommy, although it's an excellent book, but a particular group. So here we have Boy Soldiers of the Great War. This is a book which I think is based on oral history. I'm pretty sure it's based on oral history. Richard Van Emden in the 1980s went around the country looking for soldiers who had fought in the First World War and interviewing them, and very, very frequently they told him, "This is the first time I have told my story." The number of men who did not tell their story was very, very important, which is connected with trauma in general, but also particularly connected with the view of masculinity, which was the most widespread at this time. So the boy soldiers of the Great War. I've forgotten some of the details here, but I think the youngest soldier who died in the First World War, I can't remember if he was 13 or 14. And there were, especially at the beginning of the war, a large number of very young soldiers who had lied about their age, although lying about your age was not very difficult. And there's one story I remember where the young man came along and they said, "How old are you?" He says, "I'm 16. He said, "Well, go and walk around the block and come back when you're 17. Came back 5 minutes later, said, "I'm 17. No problem, you're 17. Yeah, so it was fraudulent. And interestingly enough, if you look at the newspapers at the time, you see examples of parents saying how proud they were that their boy had lied in order to get into the army. Yeah? That's something which today we probably know more about war, and maybe that would be less likely today. Let's hope so. Fascinating story here, then this about particular groups. Yeah, about this is military from below, the story of particular groups. And this book by Ilana R. Bettel is entitled "Conscripts: Forgotten Men of the Great War." I don't notice again the word "forgotten" here. It's very, very important in order to sell a book to say you're saying something that you're getting something in this book that you can't get anywhere else. And this fascinating book for a number of reasons. First of all, Ilana Bettel is a rare writer in that, as I'm sure you're not surprised to hear, military history is particularly dominated by men. Very few women involved in military history, and this has been changing recently. Ilana Bettel, Margaret Macmillan, and a few others. Lynn, we'll see her in a moment. And the story of conscripts is interesting because the stories, the diaries and the stories that come out of the First World War often concentrated on the second group in the British Army. I mentioned to you the three groups. There were people who were already in the army in 1913, the professionals. There were people who joined the army in 1914 or 15, deciding I want to join the army. And there were people who were obliged to join the army after conscription came in 1916. And in fact, the conscripts were just slightly a majority of British soldiers who fought in the war. I think over 50%, but under 55%. And so, and quite naturally, if you joined the army because you wanted to join the army, you will be more likely to want to tell your story. Whereas if you joined the army because you were forced to join the army, then you might not be so enthusiastic about telling your story, even 10 years later, even 20 years later. And so that's why Ilana Bettel said, no, we need to know what happens here. And she looks at the question of conscripts, and she asks interesting questions. I've already told you that what questions you ask as a historian is the most important thing. She asks, did the conscripts really feel they were soldiers? Or did they feel like they were civilians temporarily in soldiers' uniform for a couple of years, but really not really feeling themselves as soldiers? I have many more books to present to you, dozens and dozens and dozens, but I'm doing this in chapters of around 30 minutes, and that's 32 minutes, 15.7 seconds. So I'm going to stop there for the end of chapter 6.